The following Appalachian Mountains horror stories are real, disturbing, and should be used as warnings. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. Chloe stood frozen behind her deadbolt as a man in a navy windbreaker flashed a gold badge and claimed he was there on official federal business. He looked completely legitimate, but then she noticed his bare, dirt-caked fingers were digging into the hazardous package he was holding. That was the exact second she realized the man on her porch wasn't there to deliver the mail. He was there to deliver a nightmare. A few months ago, 35-year-old Chloe pulled up to a massive A-frame log cabin tucked deep in a dark, isolated hollow of Big Creek, Tennessee. She was a corporate blogger staring down a brutal 10,000-word deadline. Because she had been a top performer all year, her company used some leftover annual budget to rent her this high-end Airbnb so she could totally unplug and focus. The property was gorgeous, but incredibly remote, sitting at the end of a mile-long steep gravel driveway surrounded by thick, towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sun. Chloe grabbed her titanium crutches from the passenger seat, snapping the cuffs onto her forearms. Being a double-leg amputee didn't slow her down at all, and she easily swung herself up the wide wooden accessibility ramp to the front porch. Inside, a local property manager named Loretta was waiting to hand over the keys. Loretta gave a quick tour, pointing out a chunky emergency landline on the kitchen counter. She warned Chloe that the satellite internet out here barely worked, because the steep mountain ridges blocked the signal. Chloe figured that was perfect. No distractions. But as Loretta headed for the exit, she stopped dead right at the threshold. The friendly Appalachian warmth completely drained from the older woman's face. Her eyes went totally flat. She stared intensely at Chloe and whispered, "Never open the door for anyone." She didn't blink. Not for anyone. A cold prickle of unease washed over Chloe's neck. The exact second Loretta's truck crunched out of sight down the driveway, Chloe slammed the heavy iron deadbolt shut. She sat down at her desk by the window, staring out at the dark tree line. What the hell happened out here that made her say it like that? Chloe thought, the dead silence of the woods suddenly feeling a lot less peaceful. For the next 2 hours, Chloe forced herself to stare at her glowing laptop screen. She was genuinely thrilled that her company had treated her to such an amazing high-end getaway, so she could knock out her massive 10,000-word article. It was the ultimate reward. But every time she paused her typing to gather her thoughts, Loretta's flat, terrifying warning echoed in her head. The dead silence of the Appalachian Hollow didn't feel like a relaxing retreat anymore. Thanks to Loretta, it just felt empty and vulnerable. Outside the thick glass of her desk window, the shadows of the towering pine trees were already stretching long and dark across the porch. Suddenly, a heavy, sputtering engine broke the silence. Large tires crunched over the deep gravel at the very end of her mile-long driveway. A boxy, horribly rusted right-hand drive postal truck rolled to a stop down by the main road. A guy wearing a faded navy windbreaker hopped out of the right side. He walked over to the wooden mailbox post, pulled the little tin door open, and just stared inside. Then, he turned around, walked back to his truck, paused, and walked right back to the mailbox to stare inside again. He did this exact bizarre loop 4 times in a row. What in the world is this guy doing? Chloe thought, her hands freezing over the keyboard. Finally, the man stopped his weird pacing. He slowly turned his head, locking his eyes dead center on the cabin window. Without breaking eye contact, he started marching straight up the steep gravel incline toward her front porch. He definitely wasn't carrying a heavy canvas mailbag. But as he got closer, she saw his pale knuckles. His hands were clamped tightly around something small and dark. If he spent all that time staring into an empty mailbox out by the street, what exactly did he just pull from his truck to bring all the way up to her door? Heavy leather boots thumped onto the wooden planks of the front porch. Chloe shoved her desk chair backward, rolling deep into the shadows of the living room so the man couldn't spot her through the window. The man stepped right up to the front door, clutching a small, grease-stained cardboard box tightly in his hands. A sharp, aggressive knock rattled the doorframe. Chloe swung her titanium crutches onto her arms and slowly approached the front door, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Through the tiny glass window pane at the top of the door, the man suddenly flashed a shiny gold badge. His muffled, raspy voice bled through the thick wood, claiming he was a federal postal inspector who had just intercepted an alarming, hazardous package addressed directly to her. Then, he pressed his face right up against the glass window grate. He stated that the contents of the box were highly illegal, and he demanded her immediate compliance to unlock and open the door right that second. Chloe's hand hovered over the heavy iron deadbolt, the terrifying weight of federal authority pressing down on her. But as she stared through the glass at the dangerous contraband he was holding, a horrifying thought pierced through her panic. If this guy was a legitimate postal inspector carrying highly alarming and hazardous contraband, why was he holding the box with his bare, dirt-caked hands instead of using standard evidence gloves? Chloe took a shaky step backward, her titanium crutches squeaking against the hardwood floor. A cold sweat dripped down her spine as she refused to unlock the door, citing Loretta's strict rule about never letting anyone inside. The man's polite, professional mask melted away as his professional demeanor vanished into a cold rage, and he declared he had the absolute federal authority to apprehend her immediately. He slammed his bare fist against the thick oak frame. He pressed his face flush against the glass grate. To prove his jurisdiction, he began describing the layout of the cabin in vivid detail. He rattled off the narrow hallway behind her and the exact location of the reinforced basement stairs. He bragged, claiming his 98% conviction rate meant she was already guilty. "I am ordering you to submit to a federal arrest," he screamed, his raspy voice tearing through the quiet Appalachian hollow, threatening that he had every right under Title 18 to break the door down to secure the illegal evidence. Chloe braced herself, expecting him to slap an official legal document against the glass. But as his free hand dipped deep into his oversized navy windbreaker, he didn't pull out a folded piece of paper. If he had a legitimate federal warrant, why did the man pull a heavy iron crowbar from his jacket? The heavy iron crowbar smashed into the thick glass pane of the front door. A massive spiderweb of cracks instantly shot straight down the middle of the grate. The lock wasn't going to hold. Chloe knew she couldn't fight this guy, so she threw her weight onto her titanium crutches and lunged down the narrow hallway toward the basement. Loretta had explicitly mentioned the furnace room down there was the only place in the cabin with a reinforced steel interior door. She ripped the basement door open and vaulted forward. However, the rubber tip of her right crutch snagged violently on the raised metal lip of the top stair. Her momentum pitched her entirely forward. She tumbled wildly out of control down the steep wooden staircase, her shoulders and ribs slamming against the jagged edges of the steps. She hit the solid concrete floor at the bottom with a sickening thud. A sharp snap echoed in the pitch-black darkness as one of her expensive titanium crutches broke perfectly in half under her body. Her mobility was totally gone. Upstairs, the horrifying crash of the front door completely shattering to pieces echoed through the floorboards. Pure adrenaline flooded Chloe's system. She dragged her body across the freezing, dust-covered concrete, scraping her bare elbows raw as she pulled herself into the tiny furnace room and threw the heavy steel deadbolt shut. She pressed her back against the cold metal door, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. For the next 10 minutes, not a single footstep creaked above her. A heavy, dead silence fell over the entire cabin. Hoping the intruder had triggered an alarm and run away, she pulled herself up to a tiny, dirt-caked sliver of a ground-level window to look out at the driveway. As she wiped away the grime, her stomach dropped. The rusted postal truck was still parked directly in the gravel. If the house was totally silent and the man had fled into the woods, why was his vehicle still sitting right outside? Chloe shivered against the freezing steel door, bracing for the handle to turn. But instead of the lock clicking, the pitch-black woods outside suddenly exploded with flashing red and white lights. The shattering of the front door had tripped the cabin's silent security alarm, and local volunteer firefighters swarmed the property. They quickly pried open the basement and pulled Chloe to safety, but they didn't find the man in the windbreaker. He had heard the sirens echoing up the hollow, dropped his iron crowbar on the porch, and completely vanished into the thick mountain tree line. Chloe packed her bags that exact same night. She went straight home, surrounded her house with heavy-duty security cameras, and swore she would never step foot inside the Appalachian Mountains again. Now, surviving a break-in is terrifying on its own. But the truly horrifying part of this story is why that man chose that specific disguise. Most people think the United States Postal Inspection Service is just the mail police. They aren't. They are a massive, incredibly powerful federal shadow agency. They carry firearms, they execute high-level search warrants, and they have absolute, unquestionable jurisdiction over anything involving the mail. Unlike local cops who have to stop at the county line, a postal inspector can track you across 3 state lines deep into the woods without asking local police for permission. They even use digital tracking to see exactly what gets delivered to remote Airbnbs. But here is the catch. They are known as the silent investigators. They don't drive marked cruisers with sirens, and they don't wear standard police uniforms. They usually just wear plain clothes, like a faded Navy windbreaker, and carry a 6-pointed star badge that looks exactly like a cheap sheriff's prop. And that is what makes them the absolute perfect disguise for a predator. Because nobody actually knows what a real postal inspector looks like, it is terrifyingly easy to fake. Out in rural Appalachia, where the mail is a vital lifeline, if a guy with a shiny badge knocks on your door and says he intercepted a hazardous package with your name on it, you don't ask to see a warrant. You open the door because you are terrified of the government. If his radio isn't making noise, he just blames the steep mountain ridges for blocking the signal, and you believe him. By the time you realize that federal badge is just spray-painted tin, it's too late. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles of empty forest away, and you just unlocked the door for a killer. Juniper stood paralyzed in the dark hallway, listening to the heavy, deliberate footsteps moving toward her through the silent house. She was supposed to be completely alone on the mountain, and she was certain the doors were locked. But as a shadow moved in the kitchen, she realized something had already found a way in. It was exactly 1 year ago, deep in an Oconee County, South Carolina hollow, that 17-year-old Juniper finally got the one thing she had been begging for: 3 days completely home alone. Juniper wasn't exactly a rebel. She was a deeply reliable straight-A student, sang alto in the local choir, and spent most of her weekends buried in paperback novels. Still, her mom and dad were notorious helicopter parents, the kind who asked a million questions if she was even 5 minutes late getting off the school bus. So, earning this weekend of total independence was a massive victory. Right before her parents rumbled down their steep gravel driveway in a loud, exhaust-belching 2006 Dodge Ram, her dad stopped her with one last, very serious warning. He told her to make absolutely sure she locked all the windows and doors before dark, but he put a heavy, almost strange amount of emphasis on one specific instruction. She absolutely had to throw the heavy-top deadbolt on the back door. Juniper nodded, fully intending to lock it down the second they left. As soon as the truck's taillights vanished into the dense timberline, she walked straight into the kitchen. But the sheer, giddy excitement of finally having the house to herself completely took over. She piled a massive bowl high with popcorn, pinned the chunky coiled cord of the landline phone between her ear and shoulder to call her best friend, and began pacing the living room. Totally distracted by the gossip, she absent-mindedly twisted the flimsy bottom locks on all the doors and yanked the heavy curtains shut against the creeping Appalachian darkness. She completely forgot to engage that heavy-top deadbolt. The thought of double-checking the locks didn't even cross her mind. She was simply too wrapped up in the thrill of her newfound freedom. She settled onto the couch, feeling perfectly safe inside her cozy fortress. Then, right in the middle of her phone conversation, the motion sensor floodlights overlooking the driveway suddenly clicked on with a loud electronic buzz. Juniper paused her conversation and peeked through a small gap in the curtains, expecting to see a stray deer or a raccoon. Instead, the harsh white lights revealed absolutely nothing but empty gravel and gently swaying rhododendrons. If there was no animal in the yard, what had just tripped the sensor? The next afternoon, Juniper decided the best way to shake off that creepy feeling from the night before was to simply stay busy. She spent a few hours knocking out basic chores around the house, eventually stepping out into the crisp, high-altitude mountain air to hang some wet laundry on the backyard clothesline. She carefully pinned up her favorite denim jacket and a few t-shirts, enjoying the quiet, mundane rhythm of mountain living. The afternoon sun felt warm on her shoulders, and the simple task helped her convince herself that she was perfectly safe. By the time dusk rolled around, the shadows in the yard were stretching out, so she grabbed an empty plastic basket and walked back outside to gather her dry clothes. But as she stepped up to the wire, her stomach did a sickening flip. The wooden clothespins were still perfectly clamped shut on the line. However, every single piece of her clothing was completely gone. Did the wind blow them away? She thought, her heart starting to beat a little faster. But she looked down at the damp red Appalachian clay directly beneath the clothesline. There wasn't a single piece of clothing on the ground. Even worse, there wasn't a single footprint in the mud to show that anyone had been standing there. Panicking, Juniper dropped the empty laundry basket right in the dirt. She sprinted back inside the house, slammed the heavy back door shut, and, out of pure terrified muscle memory, only twisted the flimsy bottom lock. But as she stood in the kitchen trying to catch her breath, her mind caught up to a jarring detail. The air lingering around that empty clothesline hadn't smelled like pine trees or fresh laundry. It reeked heavily of stale engine grease and burnt rubber, exactly like the inside of a filthy tire shop. By the time the second night rolled around, Juniper was still completely rattled by that awful grease smell, but she eventually managed to fall asleep. At around 2 a.m. she woke up, not because of a strange noise or a terrifying nightmare, but simply because she needed to use the restroom. She threw off her quilt and swung her legs out of bed, still half asleep and rubbing her eyes in the pitch-black room. But as she stood up and took a step toward her bedroom door, she froze. Dozens of sharp, brilliant red dots of light were dancing across her floral wallpaper. Is someone outside playing a prank with laser pointers? she thought, her stomach instantly tightening. She tried to convince herself it was just some local teenagers messing around in the woods. However, the way the lights moved didn't look like a sloppy, random prank at all. They were gliding in a slow, highly synchronized grid, sweeping smoothly from one side of the room to the other. It felt incredibly unnatural, and it completely creeped her out. Juniper stood perfectly still, terrified to make even the slightest sound. She had no idea what those lights were or why they were sweeping across her walls, but every instinct in her body told her she was in serious danger. Then her blood ran absolutely cold. The red beams abruptly stopped their sweeping pattern across the wall and instantly snapped together, locking perfectly onto the exact center of Juniper's chest. By the time the third night rolled around, Juniper's nerves were completely fried. At exactly 2 a.m., she was lying awake in the dark when those exact same red laser dots suddenly returned to her bedroom wall. This time, they weren't moving slowly. They were darting around the room with a frantic, aggressive energy. She had finally had enough of feeling like a sitting duck in her own house. Gripping a heavy iron fireplace poker tightly with her clammy hands, Juniper bravely crept out of her room and down the hall into the living room to confront whoever was messing with her. When she carefully peeked around the corner into the living room, the red dots were completely gone. Instead, the pale moonlight shining through the window revealed something so much worse. A man wearing heavily stained, grease-caked mechanic's coveralls was standing on the porch. He had his face pressed completely flat against the exterior glass. As Juniper watched in absolute horror, he methodically dragged his tongue in long, wet streaks right across the windowpane. Pure adrenaline instantly spiked her heart rate. "I have to get help right now," she thought, her hands shaking violently. She quickly ducked down below the windowsill so the man couldn't see her and crawled frantically back to her bedroom. Once inside, she ripped the blinds completely shut and grabbed her phone to dial her best friend's house. She knew the county sheriff was at least 45 minutes down the mountain and definitely wouldn't get there fast enough to help. So she desperately begged her friend's dad, who lived just a short 10-minute walk through the dense woods, to come over immediately. She slammed the phone back onto its cradle, praying he would hurry. She sat completely still on her bed, gripping the iron poker and waiting for the sound of his truck. Then, the floorboards out in the kitchen area suddenly began to groan loudly under the weight of heavy, deliberate footsteps. Wait, she thought, her blood turning to ice. If all the exterior doors and windows were supposed to be closed and locked, how could someone already be walking around inside her house? The heavy, unnatural creaking of the floorboards confirmed her worst nightmare. Someone was already inside the house. In the blink of an eye, her cozy mountain sanctuary had instantly turned into a terrifying trap. Knowing she couldn't stay hidden and cornered in her bedroom, Juniper bolted out her door and into the central hallway. Her only plan was to sprint straight ahead as fast as she possibly could and burst right out the heavy front door into the dark. However, the quirky, narrow layout of that old Appalachian house created a fatal bottleneck. As she sprinted down the hall, she quickly glanced to her right, and her heart completely stopped. The greasy mechanic was already standing perfectly still inside the hallway, right by the side door. His dirty coveralls radiated that same overpowering, sickening stench of burnt steel and rubber that she had smelled by the empty clothesline. Completely trapped in the tight corridor, Juniper slammed her back flat against the wall, her lungs burning. "He's got me," she thought in absolute panic, freezing like a deer in headlights. But right at that exact second, a set of blinding high beams swept rapidly through the front living room windows. It was her friend's dad's SUV, aggressively tearing up the long quarter-mile gravel driveway to rescue her. But that heavy vehicle was still at the bottom of the hill. What exactly did this intruder plan to do to her in the agonizing 60 seconds it would take for that rescue vehicle to reach the end of the driveway, now that he was trapped inside the house with her? The heavy, unnatural creaking of the floorboards confirmed her worst nightmare. Someone was already inside the house. In the blink of an eye, her cozy mountain sanctuary had instantly turned into a terrifying trap. Knowing she couldn't stay hidden and cornered in her bedroom, Juniper bolted out her door and into the central hallway. Her only plan was to sprint straight ahead as fast as she possibly could and burst right out the heavy front door into the dark. However, the quirky, narrow layout of that old Appalachian house created a fatal bottleneck. As she sprinted down the hall, she quickly glanced to her right, and her heart completely stopped. The greasy mechanic was already standing perfectly still inside the hallway, right by the side door. Completely trapped in the tight corridor, Juniper slammed her back flat against the wall, her lungs burning. "He's got me," she thought in absolute panic, freezing like a deer in headlights. Right at that exact second, a set of blinding high beams swept rapidly through the front living room windows. It was her friend's dad's SUV, aggressively tearing up the long quarter-mile gravel driveway to rescue her. But that heavy vehicle was still at the bottom of the hill. It was going to take him at least a full 60 seconds to reach the house. In a normal situation, a minute is nothing. But standing in that dark hallway with a stranger, 60 seconds felt like a grueling eternity. Juniper pressed her spine so hard against the wall it actually hurt. Her entire body was shaking uncontrollably, and the sickening stench of burnt rubber and stale engine grease radiating off his coveralls made it incredibly hard to breathe. Desperate to survive, she tried to talk her way out. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking and barely above a whisper. "My friend's dad is practically a cop. He's pulling up right now. You have to leave. Just go." But the man didn't run. He didn't panic, and he didn't even look toward the bright headlights flashing through the windows. He just stood there, staring right through her with completely dead, hollow eyes. He doesn't care that someone is coming, Juniper realized, a fresh wave of cold terror washing over her. He's going to hurt me before that truck even gets here. Without saying a single word, the mechanic slowly reached a thick, grease-stained hand deep into the front pocket of his heavy coveralls. He took one slow, deliberate step toward her. Juniper squeezed her eyes shut and threw her trembling arms up over her face, bracing for whatever he was about to pull out of that pocket. Then, the heavy SUV violently skidded to a halt right in the front yard, sending loose gravel loudly pinging against the siding of the house. The heavy thud of a car door slamming completely broke the terrifying silence. Her friend's father leaped out into the yard, holding a blindingly bright maglite flashlight and a drawn handgun. Realizing her one chance to escape had arrived, Juniper snapped her eyes open, blindly threw open the front door, and sprinted down the porch steps. She collapsed into her friend's arms, sobbing uncontrollably while the father immediately rushed inside, sweeping every single room of that dark, creaky house with his flashlight. However, the mechanic had completely vanished. He had somehow slipped right back out the back door and into the dense Appalachian timberline before anyone could catch him. The only proof he had ever been there was a lingering smell of burnt rubber and those horrifying greasy tongue marks smeared across the window glass. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the local police finally pieced together what had actually happened. This wasn't some supernatural mountain monster or a random drifter. It was a highly organized, tech-savvy burglary ring. The cops explained that the crew used drones equipped with LiDAR, which perfectly explained those synchronized red laser beams sweeping across her bedroom wall, to digitally map the interior layout of isolated houses. Then, they sent a scout disguised in dirty mechanic's coveralls to test the perimeter and look for any weaknesses. Standing out on their newly reinforced back porch, Juniper's dad looked down at the doorframe, letting out a heavy sigh. He turned to her and asked the one crushing question she had been dreading. "Did you throw the top deadbolt like I asked?" Tears immediately filled Juniper's eyes as she admitted she had completely forgotten. The horrifying reality finally set in. That creepy scout hadn't picked a complicated lock or shattered a window to get inside. He had simply walked up to that back door, given the iffy bottom knob an easy shoulder shove, and stepped right into her life. Today, that old house is wired with a state-of-the-art, suffocatingly tight security system. Yet, 1 year later, Juniper still sleeps with all the lights on. Because she learned the hard way that no amount of fancy technology in the world can save you if you forget to turn the bolt. Gavin stood frozen in the pitch-black Appalachian hollow, his heart hammering, as a heavy, rhythmic crunching in the leaves made the ground beneath his boots actually vibrate. When he finally swung his flashlight toward the noise, the beam hit a man whose bright yellow vest was impossibly, terrifyingly spotless. It was as if this stranger hadn't walked through the mountain mud at all, but had simply materialized out of the dark. Just a few weeks ago, Gavin was standing deep in a lightless Appalachian hollow, trying to keep his frustration in check. The place was a steep, bowl-shaped mountain valley where the ancient, tangled trees completely swallowed all cell signals. As a sports medicine assistant, Gavin's job was just to manage a simple team-building camping trip for a few college football players. Instead, Marcus and Leo, two 300-pound senior offensive linemen, were treating the pristine wilderness like a frat house. Over the last hour, they had casually handed 2 red plastic cups to Trey, the team's wiry kicker. Trey was a devout Mormon who strictly avoided alcohol, but the fruit punch jungle juice was incredibly sweet, completely masking the heavy pores of vodka hidden inside. Because Trey had never had a drop of alcohol in his life, he genuinely had no idea what being drunk actually felt like. When the liquor finally crept up on him, he didn't realize his brain was misfiring. He just thought he was a little dizzy as he swayed dangerously on his feet. Marcus and Leo erupted into booming laughter as Trey stumbled backward. Gavin stepped forward, his jaw clenched with annoyance. "I've got to shut this down before someone breaks an ankle," he thought. But before he could even open his mouth, the suffocating silence of the forest was violently shattered. Just beyond the glow of their campfire, out in the pitch-black tree line, something began making a heavy, rhythmic crunching sound in the dead leaves. The massive lineman kept laughing, completely oblivious. Gavin, however, froze. A cold spike of adrenaline drove into his spine. Whatever was dragging its weight through that impenetrable mountain brush was so incredibly massive that Gavin could actually feel the ground vibrating beneath his boots. The heavy crunching abruptly stopped. The hollow fell into a dead, pressurized silence that made Gavin's ears ring. He didn't wait for the football players to stop laughing. He snatched his heavy-duty, high-lumen flashlight off the log beside him, his palms sweating against the cold metal, and clicked it on. He swept the blinding white beam directly into the tangled Appalachian brush, bracing himself to see a massive black bear. But instead of a wild animal, the bright light landed squarely on a man. He was standing perfectly still between 2 rotting pine trees, about 30 feet away. Gavin's shoulders instantly dropped, and he let out a massive breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Oh, thank God, it's just a person," he thought, feeling a sudden rush of embarrassing relief. The man was wearing a bright yellow surveyor's vest, a white hard hat, and heavy work boots. Gavin stepped forward to ask the guy if he was lost. but as his eyes fully adjusted to the glare of the flashlight, that warm relief immediately turned into a block of ice in his stomach. The surveyor was standing in shin-deep, soupy mountain mud. Gavin stopped dead in his tracks, his mind desperately trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Because the surveyor's boots, his bright yellow vest, and his pale face were completely spotless, there wasn't a single drop of dirt, rain, or sweat on him. That was absolutely impossible for anyone who had just hiked miles deep into this rugged, lightless hollow. And even worse, the man wasn't blinking. He wasn't even looking at the flashlight. He was staring directly past Gavin, his eyes locked dead on the stumbling, drunken kicker, with a stiff, unnatural smile plastered across his face. Gavin's mind was racing. He was still staring at the man's impossibly clean boots when the surveyor suddenly stepped right out of the muddy tree line and walked straight into the warm glow of their campfire. The man flashed a bright, perfectly white smile. "Got room for one more?" he joked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet night. The booming laughter from the football players instantly died. Marcus and Leo spun around, their eyes wide with shock. Gavin's heart pounded against his ribs. What the fuck is going on? He thought. This guy had just materialized out of the pitch-black woods without making a sound. But before Gavin could demand an explanation, the surveyor dropped his smile and looked completely serious. "Jokes aside, you guys have to move right now. There's a giant sinkhole opening up right under this camp. It's going to collapse tonight or maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure yet. I've been studying it for about a week now." Marcus frowned, stepping forward and crossing his massive tree trunk arms. "Wait a minute," the lineman challenged, sounding deeply suspicious. "Why are you out here working in the middle of the night?" The surveyor didn't even blink at the giant football player. "My schedule is pretty loose. I work whenever I want," he said smoothly. "But that's not the point. You all are in extreme danger. You need to pack up immediately. Either you hike back down to your cars and go home, or you come with me to my base camp up the ridge." Gavin felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Every instinct in his body was screaming that this was a trap. If this guy had been studying a muddy sinkhole in the dark for a week, why was his bright yellow vest completely clean? Gavin's lungs burned as he finally dragged himself up onto the flat expanse of rock. The surveyor's base camp was nothing more than a cold stone ledge sitting directly outside the gaping, lightless mouth of a massive limestone cave. Marcus, Leo, and Dion collapsed onto the hard ground, completely exhausted from the steep hike, having selfishly left a stubborn, drunken Trey far below in his tent. The surveyor didn't even sit down. He calmly announced he had to hike back into the dark woods to continue mapping the dangerous fault lines. Seeing the panic in Gavin's eyes, the strange man promised he would keep a close watch on Trey's tent down in the valley to make sure the kicker was safe. But the next few hours dragged by in agonizing, freezing darkness. Gavin sat shivering against the rough cave wall, his imagination running wild about the sinkhole opening up and swallowing his friend. Finally, around 2 a.m., the surveyor stepped quietly out of the black tree line. He flashed that same bright smile and told the group that Trey was perfectly fine. He claimed he had violently shaken the nylon tent and tried his hardest to wake the kicker up. But Trey was just dead to the world and snoring loudly by the dead campfire. Hearing that Trey was safe, Gavin let out a massive, shaky breath. He allowed his tense, aching muscles to finally relax against the cold stone as the surveyor crawled into a nearby sleeping bag and closed his eyes. Gavin stared out into the pitch-black woods, feeling a genuine wave of relief wash over him. But as his flashlight beam accidentally swept over a nearby tarp, his stomach violently dropped. The surveyor's heavy thermal camera and thick metal tripod were sitting underneath it, completely covered in a thick layer of undisturbed frost. If that man had just spent the last 4 hours actively mapping dangerous fault lines in the dark, why was all of his equipment sitting completely untouched? When dawn finally broke, it painted the Appalachian Ridge in a cold gray mist. Gavin's entire body ached from sleeping on the hard rock, but his mind was racing. He immediately jumped up and kicked the giant lineman awake. They didn't waste a single second. The group aggressively hiked back down the steep, muddy ridge to their original campsite to retrieve Trey. Gavin's chest was tight with anxiety, but he kept telling himself they were just going to find the kicker, hungover and complaining. But as they pushed through the final row of brush, Gavin froze. Trey's nylon tent was unzipped, the flap blowing gently in the morning breeze. Gavin felt the blood instantly drain from his face. He lunged forward, violently tearing the tent flap all the way open, praying Trey was just buried deep in his sleeping bag. But the sleeping bag was completely flat and empty. Pure, suffocating panic exploded in Gavin's chest. He whipped around and yelled at the massive linemen to spread out. Marcus and Leo completely dropped their tough guy acts, their faces pale with real, raw fear as they frantically started shoving their way through the thick, thorny mountain brush. Dion cupped his hands around his mouth and started screaming Trey's name at the top of his lungs. But the deep, ancient woods seemed to just swallow the sound almost instantly. The steep walls of the hollow trapped their voices, killing the echoes and leaving behind a dead, heavy silence that made Gavin's stomach turn. Gavin dropped to his knees in the wet dirt, desperately searching for any drag marks, dropped clothes, or footprints leading away from the camp. But the soupy mud around the tent was completely smooth and undisturbed. It was as if the wiry kicker had just evaporated into the thin morning mist. That was when the surveyor stepped out of the trees right behind them. The man put his hands on his head, feigning extreme shock. He loudly expressed his confusion, reminding the panicked group that he had been asleep right next to them at the base camp all night long. Gavin didn't have time to argue or make sense of it. They needed real help right now. The surveyor interrupted the chaos, stating he needed to hike back up to the base camp to gather his equipment. He promised he would meet them at the ranger station down the main road as soon as he was packed. Terrified for their missing friend, the massive football players turned and sprinted down the mountain to get the authorities. But as Gavin ran, a horrifying thought hit his brain like a physical blow. If the surveyor genuinely intended to meet them at the ranger station at the bottom of the mountain to help with the search, why did Gavin just watch the man walk back up the mountain, heading in the exact opposite direction of his equipment? Gavin's lungs were burning so hard, he tasted copper by the time they finally reached the bottom of the mountain. He and the 3 massive linemen burst through the heavy wooden doors of the local ranger station, frantic, covered in sweat, and completely out of breath. They frantically yelled at the ranger behind the desk, desperately explaining the giant sinkhole, the Spotless surveyor, and their missing kicker. The ranger didn't waste a single second. Within the hour, a massive search and rescue operation was deployed. Tracking dogs hit the muddy trails, and helicopters buzzed over the dense, ancient canopy of the hollow. Gavin sat shivering under a shock blanket on the station porch, staring up at the dark tree line. He kept waiting for the surveyor to finally hike down the main road and point the rescue crews to the cave. But the surveyor never arrived. By nightfall, the lead ranger walked back into the station with terrifying news. The tracking dogs hadn't picked up a single scent. When the helicopters scanned the exact area Gavin described, they didn't find a massive sinkhole or an open limestone cave. And when the search crews hiked up to the spot where the base camp was supposed to be, there was no flat rock, no tarp, and absolutely zero surveying equipment. The entire geography of the mountain they found was completely different than what Gavin and the players had experienced. Gavin felt his stomach drop into a bottomless void. He realized with a sickening certainty that Trey hadn't just fallen into a normal hole. He had been lured into the dark by something that could perfectly mimic voices, wear spotless clothes in deep mud, and manipulate the very earth itself. To this day, Trey remains just another tragic statistic, one of the hundreds of people who vanish into the ancient, unforgiving Appalachian Mountains without a single trace. You are always told that there is safety in numbers, and that staying with a group will keep you alive. But if those dark woods can completely isolate and erase you, while your massive friends are standing just a few yards away, who exactly are you trusting when you walk into the trees? For more Appalachian Mountains horror stories, click here. I'm the Shadowteller. Stay safe in the dark.